When the Democratic Party convened in Chicago to nominate a candidate to oppose Richard Nixon and succeed LBJ, two Americas faced each other across a smoldering field. The exuberant, turbulent uproar that shook the city, we hoped, would send shockwaves across the land and into the distant world. The theater that became Chicago, 1968, played on 1,000 stages, each filled with its own drama, its own feeling, action, and life. Together from the 1,000 stages came a joyful noise, a thunderous hubbub arcing toward the heavens, the riotous clamor of hope unleashed, or at least that's how we felt. We arrived on the evening of the large rally in Lincoln Park, settled our belongings into the church basement, which would be our home for a week, and hurried to the park. From the hill overlooking the great lawn, it was as if two armies had mobilized. Above, a disciplined force in blue helmets and straight lines, a massive, efficient, technological thing, armed to the teeth with steel and gas. Below, in brightly colored tents and lean-tos, sharing food and drink, semi-naked and long-haired, with clouds of marijuana smoke and strains of protest songs rising from their midst, were the rebel troops, armed merrily with their imaginations. I lingered, looking down into the swarm of people, each one distinct and flickering, dull or bright, sparkling or smooth, but together a raging blaze. I watched calmly for a moment, quietly from above, before the inevitable plunge into the chaos. Mayor Daley, pale-faced and blubbery, had decided on preemptive strikes, a strategy of disruption at every turn, seizing the initiative and hoping to disorganize and demoralize the demonstrators, setting them on the defensive. Daley would run us out of town before we could reach the amphitheater, before we could nominate Pegasus the Pig for president and release him greased and squealing into the loop, or drop acid into the water supply, or mobilize ourselves. Of course, sowing disorder in the jumble of Lincoln Park that day was child's play. Our banner was chaos, our operating assumption anarchy. Had they left us entirely alone, we would have been disorderly and a bit unglued, dancing in the demonstrations to 100 different drummers. But they imagined us more organized and threatening than we ever were, and for once our imaginations were eye to eye, running on parallel tracks, for we wanted desperately to believe the account of the enemy's paranoid wing, the vast conspiracy, the actual threat, the government on the brink of being overthrown. Who knows? It matched our highest hopes, our deepest dreams, but were we ever, even for a moment, as tight and directed and threatening as all that? Oddly, their extreme metaphors and the violent police assaults through the park combined to bring us intensely together in the field and forge a fierce fighting identity that dissolved within days, but for 1 week rose ominously as a formidable and terrible thing. You know, the activist writer, I think of activism as lighting the slow fuse of imagination. When the town crier comes around putting the village to sleep and says, "All's well," the activist stands up and says, "No, all is not well. In spite of what you think, in spite of the dogma of common sense, another world is possible, another world is necessary," and the activist points in that direction. In Why I Write, George Orwell gives 4 reasons why all writers, including himself, write. One he calls sheer egoism, the desire to seem clever, to be talked about, to be remembered after death, to get your own back on the grown-ups who snubbed you in childhood. Serious writers, Orwell says, are on the whole more vain and self-centered than journalists, though less interested in money. And I think that's impossible to deny. There's a peculiar pleasure in showing off, in disproving doubters, and in expressing oneself. The second reason Orwell calls out is aesthetic enthusiasm, the perception of beauty in the external world, or on the other hand, in words and their right arrangement. The third he calls historical impulse, the desire to see things as they are, to find out true facts and store them up for the use of posterity. And finally, he points to political purpose, using the word political in the widest possible sense, the desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's idea of the kind of society that they should strive for. Orwell elaborates and goes on to say, "I'm a person in whom the first 3 motives would outweigh the 4th. In a peaceful age, I might have written ornate or merely descriptive books and might have remained happy, almost unaware of my political loyalties. As it is, I've been forced to become a sort of pamphleteer. In a peaceful age, one wonders what that would look like. But the Spanish Civil War turned the scale, and for Orwell, thereafter, I knew where I stood. Orwell was perhaps the most insightful witness to the range of horrors that had afflicted the 20th century. But he was an unparalleled ethicist. His novels 1984 and Animal Farm together sold more than any other author in the century. And his personal essays and memoirs, From Homage to Catalonia to Down and Out in Paris and London and Burmese Days, are all classics. In any case, when I think of activism and writers, I think of Orwell. I think of somebody who planted his flag, who stood on principle, and who was unbowed by all kinds of pressures from left and right. The ability of activist writers is to kind of try to search out and fight for relative independence from all manner of social and institutional pressures, and to choose oneself against a hard wall of facts. You can't be a pacifier or a consensus builder, but you have to be willing to stake out a critical sense of what's going on in the world. You have to resist cliches and accommodating to power. You have to find an independent voice or a mind of your own. I don't think there's anything particular about Chicago that brings out activism in writers, except that I think of Richard Wright and the great Gwendolyn Brooks and Studs Terkel, and I think all of them represented the finest traditions of being willing to kind of speak the truth as one finds it, and in that way inspire huge numbers of people to also seek the truth in their own lives.